Hello, I am Michael Hayes. Welcome to this session on the impact of extreme events on water, food systems, and human health. I am a climatologist in the School of Natural Resources at the University of Nebraska in Lincoln. I've been at Nebraska for about 26 years now, and I was at the National Drought Mitigation Center for many of these years, including serving as the NDMC director for almost 10 years. My current research focuses on the use of climate information in decision-making. This session today focuses on extreme events and the impact these events have on water, food systems, and human health. The data show that deaths from extreme events and natural disasters are decreasing with time, but the world still experiences individual events with high number of fatalities, such as the 2004 Indonesia earthquake and tsunami, the 2010 Haitian earthquake, or the heat wave events in Chicago, Europe in 2003, and Russia in 2010. However, the data also demonstrate that the number of extreme events and natural disasters are increasing with time, and that economic losses associated with these events is also increasing with time. The reason for these increases are complex, but certainly climate change is playing a role in contributing to these events. Climate change is expected to bring a variety of impacts that will differ across space and between seasons. These impacts include an increase in heat wave events, heavy rain events, dry or warm seasons, adding up to a potential for heat mortality, droughts, floods, wildfires, and other extreme events and natural disasters. These extreme events have a great impact on water and food systems, as well as human health. In this session, speakers will discuss the major challenges facing society and address opportunities to provide more water and food security in a changing world. Panelists will describe adaptation and preparedness strategies and explore the relationship between soil health, extreme events, and impacts on water and food security. The first panelist is Jessie Bell. Dr. Bell is the Director of Water, Climate, and Health at the Doherty Water for Food Global Institute and the Global M. Hubbard Professor of Water, Climate, and Health at the University of Nebraska Medical Center.
Hello, I'm Jessie Bell. I'm the Claire M. Hubbard Professor of Water, Climate, and Health, and I'm the Director of the Water, Climate, and Health program at UNMC and Director of Water, Climate, and Health at Water for Food Global Institute. I'm going to be talking about extreme events and how they're impacting water and food systems, but also how they're impacting our health as well. So just to start off, if we're going to be talking about extreme events, one of the things we should be discussing is climate change. We know that our climate is changing. We know that temperatures have risen. We know that precipitation patterns have changed and extreme weather events are now more intense and more frequent than they were in the past. And we expect these trends to continue in the future as well. And so this change in our climate system is having impacts on our health and will continue to have impacts on our health as well. And so with rising temperatures, more extreme weather, rising sea levels, changes in CO2, all of these things change the environment around us in some way. And those changes in the environment then lead to human health outcomes. So for example, the influence that could potentially have on water and food supplies, which then can lead to malnutrition and diarrheal disease, or water quality impacts that can lead to things like cholera and harmful algal blooms. And then severe weather events, when those occur, they can cause injuries, fatalities, and mental health impacts as well. And so climate, as I was stating, climate has a variety of different ways that it's impacting our health. But to break it down, climate has direct impacts and indirect and delayed impacts. Direct impacts are the things like air pollution, extreme heat, extreme weather. Those are the things that when those events occur, they have immediate impacts on our health. They send people to the hospital, they send people or they can potentially kill people as well. And then the indirect, these are the delayed, these are the things that manifest more slowly over time. And so the spreading of disease, the disruption of food supplies and water supplies, and disruption of well-being as well. And so when we talk about climate and the impacts that it has on our health, especially over the last century internationally, we know that drought has likely led to more deaths than any other climate or weather-related disaster. And this is primarily due to famine and malnutrition. But when we're talking about what are the potential impacts here in the United States, where I'm located, heat waves are actually probably the leading killer every year compared to other climate and weather-related issues. And that's just because of the way that heat waves manifest. Everywhere in the United States has a heat wave, most likely any particular year, where many of these other climate and weather-related events occurs more sporadically. And also, not only do they have health impacts, these types of events have impacts on the economy as well. And so over the same time span from 2000 to 2004 to 2013, hurricanes resulted in the most economic cost, with about $400 billion. Heat waves and droughts related back to about $78 to $80 billion. And so I put this figure up here because it's really important to understand that those other factors that are potentially connected to health outcomes associated with climate and climate change and extreme weather events. And so we have this linear pathway here. We have a climate drivers, exposure pathway, and health outcomes. And so that's how we get to human health outcomes, that changes in climate that result in environmental change in some capacity, then relate back to human health issues. But the reason I put this up here is because of those gray boxes on the outside, the environmental institutional context and the social and behavioral context. These two things are very important for understanding the types of health outcomes that occur, the number of health outcomes occur, and these are also sometimes the things that we can help change or provide support to reduce the potential health impacts as well. And so when we're talking about environmental institutional context, this is the environment that we live in. This is the natural and man-made environment that we live in. So this is the infrastructure around us. This is the environment, ecosystem change, land use change, the type of agriculture that is taking place. That has impacts on our health. And then we have the social and behavioral context. And so this is the people that live within the community that we're a part of. And so this is just defined by the age and gender, race, ethnicity, poverty, housing, infrastructure, education, lack of access to care, and pre-existing health conditions. And so when we talk about climate, we talk about extreme weather events, all populations are potentially vulnerable, but certain populations are more at risk. Here in the United States, where I'm at, these four populations are especially more at risk, and that's communities of color, children, older adults, and low-income communities. And there's a variety of different reasons for that. And it goes back to some of that social and behavioral context that I was talking about with that previous figure. These are the social determinants of health, pre-existing health conditions, lack of access to care, where some of these communities potentially are located. Are they in areas that are more prone to some of these disasters? And then also racism and discrimination that can occur within communities that hampers access to care and other issues as well. And so when I talk about climate change, we're talking about the impacts being now. This isn't just 50 to 100 years into the future. We are in a changed climate. And those changes in our climate system are having impacts on us and our communities. For example, this is looking at billion-dollar disasters across the United States. This is calculated by NOAA. And so each one of these billion-dollar climate and weather-related disasters that are calculated by NOAA are just that. They're disasters that exceed $1 billion in economic loss. They've been calculating this for the last 40 plus years. And one of the things that you'll notice over time is we've been seeing an increase in these billion-dollar disasters, and the costs have been increasing as well. And that's partially due to the changes in extreme weather and climate events that have happened over that time span, but also because of things like changes in our economy as part of that. 2020 was a bad year for a lot of reasons. 2020 was obviously, we think of it in the context of COVID, but here in the United States, that was a record-setting year for the number of climate and weather-related disasters that exceeded $1 billion of economic loss. We had 22 here in the US. And so we're seeing these impacts now. 2021 is not getting much better. This is a report that came out from the Washington Post. Already this year, we've had about 18 weather and climate-related disasters that have exceeded $1 billion in the US. And so the direct health impacts, those are the ones that are most obvious, but the indirect or delayed health impacts are sometimes appreciated or not noticed or not as well studied. And one of those especially is the mental health impacts that some of these disasters have, and especially when we're talking about things like drought. We know based off of research and evaluation of droughts that have occurred nationally and internationally that especially in places like Australia, India, and Africa, that when major droughts have occurred, they've seen increases in suicide in farming communities. We also experience that here in the United States. We have in the US, our farming communities and our farmers already have higher suicide rates than many other occupations in the United States. And here's just two anecdotal examples from different news sources. The one from where they interviewed the Kansas farmer about the alarming suicide rates in farming community or in farmers. He said, nothing gets a farmer down more than a drought. And that's what some of the research that we're doing is actually showing. And so this is with a group of collaborators from Iowa and Minnesota. And here in the United States, we looked at Midwestern farmers and 500 Midwestern farmers in the central part of the United States. There was a questionnaire that was provided to them over multiple years, looking at occupational stress and hazards. And one of the questions within there, or some of the questions within there, were addressing psychosocial stress that these farmers were experiencing. This particular survey happened to fall over a major drought event that happened here in the United States. And when we evaluated those responses, especially in the context of psychosocial stress, we saw an increase in reported stress in farmers during that growing season where the drought was actually occurring. And actually, when you look at it, the effect estimate for drought was 4 times greater magnitude than people reporting pain, because that was what the survey was originally designed for, is to look at physical pain and physical ailments. There was a 4 times greater magnitude reporting of stress than with individuals reporting pain from some of the ailments that they were experiencing. And so public health has an opportunity to engage around some of these issues, whether it be extreme events or climate change, with helping educate the public, enhancing monitoring of some of these particular issues, more research of understanding some of these links between climate and health, and then contributing to public dialogue so that we make sure that human health and healthcare is actually a part of these discussions moving forward. There's already resources out there. I work a lot on drought and the impacts that drought has. And so with that, CDC has resources, and I used to work at CDC and help with developing some of these fact sheets, guidance documents for public health officials, and resource guides as well for addressing especially things like drought and how it impacts human health and how public health can better engage around this. But climate change is local. These impacts are local. And so even though these broader guidance documents are good, we still need to make sure that we're addressing this at a regional level, because there is so much that is actually going on at the regional level that might be specific to that region. But there's also generality or things that you can make more general about the entire situation as well. And so one of the things that we're doing is actually providing workshops throughout the country where we're working with public health officials to try to understand how they're addressing drought and what are some of the gaps and limitations in some of the work that they're doing, so we can better prepare our communities in the future. So closing thoughts, extreme weather and climate events affect food systems and our health. Climate change is a significant health threat. All people are vulnerable to the health impacts associated with extreme events and climate, but some are more vulnerable or more at risk than others. The costs of this are increasing, both in terms of financial and health. There's multiple relationships that need to be understood. And there's a lot by actually providing a platform for public health to be engaged around some of these topics and areas as well. And today, I'm just kind of setting the stage, but we have multiple other speakers that are going to discuss some of these relationships in more detail. And so with that, thank you very much. And I'm happy to take any questions during our Q&A session.
Our next presenter is Maher Salman. Maher is a senior officer in water scarcity for the Food Agriculture Organization of the United Nations, FAO.
I'm happy to be with you today and have the chance to contribute to this event. My name is Maher Salman, and I'm a senior water officer at the Land and Water Division of FAO, as well as the focal point for drought work of the organization and the coordinator of the adaptation fund in it. I'll be trying to give some insights to the integrated drought management, focusing on drought risk mitigation measures. We're all aware of the effects of droughts, which often result in severe humanitarian and economic crises. Drought cannot be avoided, but we can certainly do a lot to prevent the humanitarian and economic disasters that too often follow droughts. In fact, the way we manage droughts, the way institutions respond to this natural phenomenon, can deeply affect the effects of drought on vulnerable communities and ecosystems. For a long time, there has been a tendency to respond to drought and intervene only once drought has occurred by undertaking ad hoc emergency measures. It's now evident that while emergency relief measures bring immediate benefits, they can also cause increased dependencies and so increase long-term vulnerability. Preparedness for drought risks and risk mitigation can involve a range of different sectors and strategic entry points, from water conservation and natural resource management to multi-hazard approaches. Let's see how it works in a couple of sectors. In the water and sanitation sector, inadequate water storage and supply systems can cause shortages and increase cost during droughts. To mitigate this risk, storing water and regulating flow levels in water bodies help to maintain safety while also reducing water demand. Let's see the agriculture sector. In the agriculture sector, the lack of rainfall or water supplies for drinking and irrigation reduces the productivity. It also can threaten water quality for fisheries, reduce the survival of trees, and increase deforestation due to cutting of trees for emergency feed, fuel, and income generation. To mitigate this risk, it is essential to store and conserve water and feed supplies, cultivate drought-resistant crops and livestock varieties, protect forest and grazing reserve areas, of course, amongst others. But of course, sound and efficient integrated drought management needs financial resources, sufficient knowledge, and adequate capacities at the individual and also at institutional levels. In some areas, drought managers have time and resources to invest in recovery, in learning, in restoration and transformation phases. But in the more drought affected regions, this has often not been possible. In such cases, the recovery phase, if ever present, may never receive the level of resourcing and attention needed. So, making the connection back from recovery and learning to explore new and improved proactive approaches to preparation and planning can make the difference between a drought-sensitive situation and a more drought-resilient one. Drought risk is usually conceptualized as a function of drought hazard combined with the exposure and vulnerability of an ecosystem or a community. The international community, in fact, is working hard to mitigate the extent to which climate change is causing the intensification of meteorological drought hazards. And on top of it, there are also other entry points through which it is possible to more immediately mitigate drought risks. These include actions to reduce other aspects and causes of the drought hazard, such as the hydrological, the ecological, or the socio-economic ones. They can also involve directly reducing the exposure of ecosystems and communities to these hazards. Let me now focus a bit more on the role of land and water management interventions. Not only land and water intervention contribute to reducing exposure to drought effects, but they can also reduce the incidence and severity of hydrological drought hazards. In fact, they allow the increase in water storage in the soil and vegetation. Since usually land and water management interventions are planned and implemented at the local level with the communities, they also contribute to economic and social development objectives. They can also immediately reduce vulnerability to drought and help to build the resilience of the community. This type of measures often appears in national strategies for drought management, water management, land management, adaptation to climate change, though more efforts should be done to monitor their impacts in terms of reducing drought risk and increasing the reserve of water available to buffer droughts. Let me give a couple of examples from the field. The first one from Brazil on how land and water interventions can help reduce the incidence and severity of hydrological drought hazards. In Brazil, national drought responses have mostly included distribution of water, food, and cash. In the past, these programs often were linked with work programs for job creation and distribution of food or small payments. Brazil has succeeded to put in place a national water policy which has helped to identify needs for new aqueducts and wells to be built and new source of water to be sought. The last major drought emergency in Brazil occurred in 2017, during which it became evident that the national social protection system had largely replaced the work programs, and that shift was sufficient to prevent the drought emergency from escalating into a national calamity. Another case from the field is from Tunisia. This one provides an example of early action with the analysis of groundwater and surface water reservoir deficits with monitoring systems in place. In southern Tunisia, droughts cause the interruption of drinking water supplies and lead to considerable loss of agricultural production. Local communities have been employing a wide range of traditional water harvesting practices to collect and conserve water in or on the hill slopes and wadi beds of the percentage of annual rainfall that captured and used each year in the catchment. However, this percentage is unknown, So the quantitative difference made by nature-based solutions, such as water harvesting, is not fully assessed. As a result, decision makers do not have complete information about the volume of risks that can be mitigated when they are assessing these options. An EU-funded project has put in place a piezometer system that is generating data to enable improved modeling of groundwater recharge processes under drought and non-drought conditions and to evaluate the effects of different practices. 2.5 years of data is enabling actually researchers to improve previous estimates of the effects of rainfall patterns on groundwater levels in an area where water harvesting structures are in use. Another critical aspect, let me say, of drought risk mitigation is the role of institutions. The efficiency of institutions is indeed key in decreasing drought risk. If national ministries and agencies for water resources management are not able to reach the drier regions of their countries, drought risk mitigation becomes harder. Let's take the case of Mexico. In 2013, the Drought Prevention and Mitigation Measures Program in Mexico were created in 26 watershed councils across the country. For each of the 26 basin councils, a specific program of measures to prevent and mitigate drought is elaborated following a vulnerability assessment. The success of these programs relies on the watershed council's ability to appropriate the vulnerability assessment, collectively assimilate the problems, and build the necessary agreement among their stakeholders to implement solutions. Another case is in Kenya. From Kenya, there is an interesting case where it helps understanding how institution building enables community to overcome conflicts surrounding access to resources during periods of scarcity. Some recent governmental reforms in Kenya involve the devolution of several key functions from the national government based in Nairobi to country governments. The scope was to give more autonomy and support to the population through local level development planning, management, and provision of basic services that includes water, health, and local roads. Another example where gender-sensitive approaches are more apparent to include women in institution building is with our own case in FAO, with our initiative that is called the Central Asian Countries Initiative for Land Management. This initiative includes a gender equality and social inclusion strategy based on the needs and previous experience of the management on gender issues. Long-term process-oriented competence development focuses on staff attitude, values, and knowledge of gender equality, gender roles and responsibility of women and men was part of this. Since droughts will always occur, dealing with emergencies remain a necessary part of proactive management of drought. This requires effective responses to be ready and prepared in advance. In these cases, it's important to understand how continuing response systems and actions contribute to rather than weaken longer-term drought resilience. Since 1970s, the international community has accumulated 5 decades of experience in responding to droughts and other disasters, and it's evident that rapid and well-targeted responses can help to avoid the escalation of losses by enabling early actions at the onset of droughts. Once a drought emergency is declared, there is a departure from normal operating conditions. Plans will be changed. Basic services may not be assured to citizens and procedures. This also has effects on budgeting and resource allocation, as they have to be adjusted to respond to this crisis. To avoid and reduce problems concerning the declaration of droughts and increase the systematization of response measures, many countries have established ways to classify different levels of drought status. Often, these are systematized via early warning systems. Let me conclude. What is needed today is to go beyond risk mitigation and embrace transformative change to turn global drought threats into opportunities and drought events from disasters into development success stories. So, let's see what we have learned so far. First, we can conclude that at present, we can count on several options to mitigate, prepare, and respond to drought risks. We also realized that different options have been adapted to work in different contexts. And another lesson we learned is that proactive approach led to improvements over time. In fact, the shift from emergency response to the more proactive approach for preparedness is probably the major lesson learned by the international disaster risk reduction community so far. And with this, I conclude, and I thank you very much for your attention.
Our next presenter is Andrew Odero. Andrew Odero focuses on regional vulnerability and analysis and mapping for the Southern Africa region. He's with the World Food Program.
Thank you. My name is Andrew Odero. I'm the Senior Regional Food and Security Analysis Advisor for Southern Africa. I'm based in Johannesburg. I'm very, very pleased to share, to join in this session to share on the impacts of extreme events on water, food systems, and human health. As you know, Southern Africa is a climate hotspot, and this is increasingly observable in the increasing frequency and severity of climate shocks in the region. And starting from 2015, 2016, the region experienced at that time what was the most severe drought in 35 years. And since then, the region has continually experienced first, the lingering effects of that drought, and secondly, a continuation of erratic and mixed rainfall performance throughout many seasons. And I can say that since 2015, 2016, one of the seasons that was clear-cut, good season was 2016, 2017. However, we continually see the recurrence of droughts and flooding, including extreme events like cyclonic activities, like what we had in 2019 and 2019, and when Cyclone Idai hit for the first time as the strongest cyclone ever to make landfall. And as we talk right now, we have the worst drought, or the driest drought seasons in Angola, Western Angola, and South Madagascar. And we are continuing to see the debilitating impacts of drought as a result of the climate extreme events in our region. Now, this extreme events have placed an enormous pressure on the food systems. As you well know, that majority of production in Southern Africa, actually more than 70% of the population depend on rain-fed agriculture in the region. And because of the occurrence of these extreme events in the form, particularly in the form of drought, we have seen food systems being placed under a lot of pressure and a lot of deficits being experienced in terms of crop failure, below normal production that necessitates a huge importation of food into the region. As a result, we see that that drought is a significant driver of food insecurity in our region. And from the figures that I'm projecting here, we can see that since 2017, 2018, the figures have been on an upward trend. And in the last 2 seasons, the figures have topped close to at least 50 million, of course, and this was due to this, partly due to also the COVID impact that started off in that is become more visible in 2021, 2022. Now, not only food production is constrained in our region, which is also very water deficit, we have seen also a significant decline in available water resources in our region. Long ago, just around 2017, 2018, 2016, 2017, we saw a whole city potentially running without water. And there was a lot of concern that Cape Town, for example, would not have enough water to run keep itself going. In some situations, like we observed in Lesotho and Eswatini, mothers were preferring to deliver their children at home during the peak of the drought season because there was no water at the health facilities. So we see clearly that extreme climate extremes affect water, they affect food, they affect health, and require a very comprehensive approach. And of course, for very obvious reasons, there is a model, there is a nexus between all these points. People spend inordinate amounts of time looking for water, which comes with a big opportunity cost to farm their to prepare their land. And with limited water, there is a prioritized use of water, and which leads to increased waterborne diseases. And waterborne diseases affect nutrition intakes, which affect child health. So we see this water, food, and health are inextricably linked. And whenever there is a heavy drought in the region, we also expect to see a spike in waterborne diseases. We expect to see also a direct increase in malnutrition, as we have experienced in South Madagascar. So what is WFP doing? So WFP is intervening in four main areas. One is in innovative analytics and early warning, which I will talk about briefly, in trying to develop anticipatory planning mechanisms that help in detecting early detection of climate extreme events and doing something about it beforehand. And increasingly also, WFP is working on investing in community resilience programs, not only to help communities cope and absorb the impacts of extreme events like drought in the region, but it also helps to lessen the impact of the shocks when they occur. So I'll take, for the rest of my presentation, I will take each of these pieces, actions, one by one. So starting with the analytics and early warning, WFP in Southern Africa region has developed a model that is just based on the classic hazard, exposure, and vulnerability approach. And we use satellite images, which are shown to my left, and we combine this data into a single drought index. We multiply by, and we multiply the exposure index factors that we find with the multidimensional poverty index and estimate the risk of populations that are in drought. And the graphic that I have before us now shows the outcome at the end of the last season of at the end of the drought, the rainy season, at the end of the cropping season in 2021. Now, which shows clearly North Mozambique and Southwest Angola as being those areas that are highly affected by drought. And in addition, Madagascar is also experiencing one of the most severe droughts in almost nearly 40 years. So with this analytics, which we are able to run now, we've run this for the last 3 seasons, we are able to establish the order of magnitude of flood impacts that could affect that the order of magnitude of drought impacts as manifested in the region. And it enables us to have this information well ahead of the season, which allows for the anticipatory planning approach to occur. And in the anticipatory action approach, we actually start off by doing a risk analysis, and which I've already described. And we use that information long before the impact of drought become apparent to implement some anticipatory actions. And these anticipatory actions help to prepare the affected populations to absorb the impacts of the shock or lessen the severity of the impact of the shock. So it goes on in a cycle that allows us to always try to anticipate and be better prepared with lots of lessons on how to prepare even better for the next season. And of course, this comes with also the approach that we use for focus-based financing, where again, we implement the anticipatory actions long before the need for assistance occurs. And that helps actually to reduce the cost of the response when at the peak of the lean season, which happens normally in during the growing season. So I wouldn't want to end my presentation without speaking about the community resilience programs. As you know, WFP is a field-based organization, and we engage with communities, at the level where they are affected by the impacts of extreme shocks. And the approach that we are using in building resilience projects is to integrate food assistance programs, which come either in the form of in-kind food or cash, to implement assets development and support smallholder farmers through microinsurance and through access to climate services to build resilience. And we have found that these community assets actually help in preparing the households to absorb the shocks, and also to help in diversifying their livelihood, so that when they experience crop failure from the main crop, they can grow vegetables, they can grow other cash crops that would help them to meet their needs. So WFP, particularly in Zimbabwe, has worked extensively with communities to rehabilitate and expand community irrigation infrastructure, which has actually helped to cushion communities whenever there is crop failures. They're able to diversify their cropping. So, and this is done in collaboration with governments, with local organizations, with civil society, to achieve the goals of ensuring that the households actually are cushioned from the impacts of extreme climate events from in our region. So with that, I would like to end my presentation, and I thank you.
Our next presenter is Dr. Rachael McDonnell. Dr. McDonnell is the Deputy Director General for Research for Development at the International Water Management Institute, or IMI.
Hi, I'm Rachael McDonnell. I'm delighted to meet you today and be with you to think about balancing across the water and food security challenges that we have under increasing extremes. So let me just share my screen with you a minute. So we can see this playing out in so many different parts of the world, the balance of food and water security, and that's just in everyday life. But then comes the extremes, and particularly droughts and floods, how they challenge what we can do, how we can use that, the water that's available. Unfortunately, this year, we've seen record droughts and floods hitting so many parts of the world, and the challenges that we've seen through these extremes have been shown to be based on scientific evidence from the IPCC report that came out that highlighted since 1950s, we've had a significant increase in the number of floods and of droughts, and their predictions and their models show this is going to increase in both severity and frequency. So this new normal is something we need to start beginning to adjust to and to make our technologies and solutions come together, because this is playing out in many areas of the world. We can see that many countries are realizing that droughts and floods are major challenges to them. So in the nationally determined contribution report to the NDC submission to the UNFCCC, the framework on combating climate change, we can see that here, for example, in Pakistan, look at what they're saying. We've got to enhance resource management. They want to look at how we can manage adaptation in agriculture, but also improving their emergency response mechanisms for managing climate extremes and for linking that to disaster relief. So we can see in terms of adaptation, they identify agriculture, so food, and water security and climate extremes as critical in their climate change adaptation. If we go to Jordan, Jordan has literally just submitted their their NDC submission, and we can see they're saying that there's going to be real water resource challenges in the country. They can see that major areas of rain-fed agriculture will significantly shrink, it says, and this has all sorts of implications for agriculture. They want to maintain agricultural production at the same level, so more water will be required for irrigation. In terms of adaptation, they're putting forward ways to adapt to that, but we can see this amplified in many countries as well. These are just two examples, one from Asia, one from West Asia, highlighting that countries are acknowledging that these climate extremes are going to be impacting both water and food security. So let's look at some of those images that we can think about this. So again, taking examples for the MENA Drought Project. The left-hand side is from the Bekaa Valley in Lebanon, which you might know is a really important production area in Lebanon. In previous droughts, when there was critical low levels, water was cut off to all sorts of crops, including these tree crops, which are a significant part of the income. And often the water changes are quite abrupt. There's very little warning. On the second image here, we can see it's from Morocco. And this was the drought in 2016-2017. And what again happened here is the organization managing the droughts, managing the reservoirs and the water resources, first cut off the water to agriculture. It's seen in all these countries, we have to manage the strategic resource and to ensure that people and often commerce are prioritizing the amount of water we're having. So this whole water versus food security, particularly under extremes, is coming out in many different countries. These are just two examples that we can think about. So what do we need to do? Well, so one of the big problems is, of course, water governance. Many of our water governance models do not reflect water futures. They are based on historical numbers, historical thinking about who should have the water, when it should be, the licensing, the allocation. And what we're seeing is during droughts, there is this major challenge of an increasing illegal access to water during extremes. And this is obviously has jeopardizing particularly groundwater systems, and we need to think about how we can increase that governance. What we see are laws, regulations, often based on fixed volumes, and what the IPCC report, but it's what we see every day in any case, is that those fixed volumes are, if you're upstream or if you have prior rights to it, this and you have less water there, is very much impacting those downstream or those with less strengthened rights. So we've got to be able to balance across this. And what we're seeing in a number of countries these days, South Africa, parts of Latin America, there is an updating of the laws, regulations, and allocations to then take percentages. So in a particular year, you would take a percentage. So therefore, it can be shared more equally across the strategic reserve water for people and water for agriculture. And we're beginning to look at the ideas of polycentric governance. What we also can look at is how we can use data. And of course, Nebraska is the big center for drought and drought management, and we've been delighted working with them. So again, here in the data that I'm able to show is we're able to look at where there are droughts. We can track those droughts and then ensure that decision makers can then respond. So this area known as Western Tafila was an area that experienced exceptional drought this year, and severe to exceptional drought. And the Ministry of Agriculture, to manage their food security, was able to step in and support farmers there to make it to pass through the drought and then be able to then plant their crops this year. So this is how we can help countries respond, but particularly farmers respond to droughts, because what we do know is that water for people will be prioritized. We're also doing a lot more experimenting in seasonal forecasting. So as a decision maker, as a minister, or as a manager of a reservoir and all that, you need to know what's happening in the future. So we're beginning to use a lot more of seasonal forecasting of extremes. So this is again for Jordan. You can see on the left-hand side, this is the rainfall amount predicted for November and for December, and then looking at that rainfall relative to anomalies. This is under very early testing, but imagine if we can then be bringing this type of higher resolution forecasting to governments, particularly in water scarce areas, that we can help them support the decision making on allocation and steps to take earlier rather than during the actual extreme event. We can also look at technologies, and as we look across the food and water security systems, we can think about agriculture and water technology bundles. So what can we do? We can bring in more drought resilient crops that might be a change in crop from, say, wheat to olives, or we can bring in crops that have been bred to be more drought resilient. And we can see this in many different varieties of wheat, of barley, of those staple crops. What can we do? We can also, of course, manage water efficiently. So what can we do in terms of moving from flood irrigation, which is still prevalent in many countries, to drip irrigation? But we see that that isn't necessarily going to relieve water for useful for in the domestic sector. What we often see is there is this move towards more water efficiency, but by that saving of water, it isn't put into the system for other uses. It's often used to expand agricultural use. So in the end, you actually don't save water. You've expanded your food security base. What we also do know in terms of helping farmers adapt to extremes, policies and incentives are an important part of that to driving that change. But we need to also understand the social and economic context within which those policies and incentives are being used. There's some work that we have been doing in Jordan, again, has been looking at the move towards drip irrigation and what have been some of the issues with that. And some of this has been looking at different ways of using that drip irrigation and the operating regimes that is there. And from our analysis, we can see that farmers who have experienced droughts in the past tend to water more than those that have not been hit by those hardships. So we can see there's all sorts of behavioral economics as well as just the straight technologies that we need to think about as we manage that water, energy, food security balancing. So in terms of key messages, I think what we have learned from EME's work across many different parts of the world is that uncertainty dominates our future. But if we can bring in good governance, we can use data effectively and technology bundles, we can help build resilience. So we need to think about what that resilience looks like to those drought or flood events, but we can bring in parts of the different pieces of the puzzle that can help farmers adapt to increasing extreme droughts. But what we also need to do, if we then expand that in terms of that water food security nexus, is that we have to find solutions. What we're seeing at the moment, those extreme events are undoing decades of development and increasing inequality in a number of areas of this world. The way we do that, we have to think across the systems. We can't, at the moment, we have these silos where water works and water resource management is in one area and agriculture and food is in another area. And there's little going across those nexus. Something like the Water for Food Global Conference and the work of Doughty Water for Food Institute is really important to break down those silos, but we need to do that a lot more in many different areas. So thank you very much for your attention. I'm delighted to be here with you. I've brought a little bit of insight from the work that we're doing and look forward to our conversations on the October 28th. Thank you.
Our next presenter is Dr. Chris Funk. Dr. Funk is the director of the Climate Hazard Center at the University of California, Santa Barbara.
Hello, everyone. My name is Chris Funk, and I'm the director of the Climate Hazard Center here at the University of California, Santa Barbara. And I'm really honored to speak today about adaptation and early warning in a warming world. A little bit of background. I grew up in a little tiny farm town in northern Indiana. My great-grandfather and grandfather and father were all engaged in hybrid seed corn production, helping to lay the foundation of that. But now I'm the director of the Climate Hazard Center here in Santa Barbara. Never learned to surf, but it's nice to be here. And we do a lot of work with the U.S. Agency for International Development's Famine Early Warning Systems Network, trying to anticipate droughts primarily in Africa and Central America with an international team to support famine prevention. I have a couple of recent books that I'm going to draw from. There's a book, Drought Early Warning and Forecasting, that I did with my friend Shrad Shukla, that talks about how to anticipate and detect droughts. I have another book in 2021 with Cambridge Press called Drought, Flood, Fire, How Climate Change Contributes to Catastrophes, that talks about how extremes are becoming more dangerous. That's a kind of accessible book that you might be interested. There's some links. And if you kind of look at the space, the kind of overlap between those two books, it leads to thinking about how to develop early warning systems that can help us adapt to a more hazardous world. And so in that context, how we think about climate change really matters. Early warning systems depend on search patterns. So you can think about back in World War II, when there were bombers coming in over the horizon, you wanted to detect them as early as possible. And to do that, a radar needs a search pattern. And in a warming world, we need to watch out for the drought-inducing influences of extremely warm sea surface temperatures. And we need to watch out for the desiccating impacts of exceptionally warm air temperatures. These are two major pathways of risk that are becoming more dangerous with climate change. And so, one of the things we can work towards is early warning systems that stack different sources of information. And excellence arises by stacking sources of predictive skill, just like a sports team or a business, reaches excellence by combining, the skills of lots of different types of people. And droughts are complex, slow onset, multi-scale, and multi-temporal hazards. And so we need to develop complex, multi-scale, multi-temporal scale systems that stack information. And so, if we go from high resolution to low resolution, from now into the future, we can begin with data sets like the Landsat data set, which is high resolution, really high reliability. And, from that, we can, make predictions based on the seasonal cycle and the persistence of anomalies. So if the vegetation is dry this month, it's also likely to be dry next month. Then looking out further, we can work with medium resolution weather observations, and we can utilize lag relationships between weather and vegetation. So if it's hot and dry, this month, then it's likely that the vegetation may be browner next month. Then going forward in time, we have quite skillful weather forecasts that we can use to anticipate conditions over the next couple of weeks. And again, that can inform drought prediction. And then finally, we can look out over, say, perhaps the next 8 months, where information about extreme sea surface temperatures can provide analogs that we can use to anticipate outcomes in the future. So in the next couple of slides, I'm actually going to work backwards from this image from the bottom row up to the first, and just give some examples of this. So as we all know, the Earth is warming, but the rate of that warming is really quite stunning over the last 10, 15 years. So if we look at changes in the fraction of the Earth's surface that is exceptionally warm, in the late 2000s, it was about 8% of the surface in any given month. And now it's about 25%. So about a fourth of the Earth in any given month is exceptionally warm, but that warmth moves around, and paying attention to that gives us opportunities for drought prediction. And so if we look at how things were late summer and this fall, what we see are exceptionally warm waters in the Western Pacific. I call this the Western V region, and relatively cool waters in the Eastern Pacific. And if we look at time series of sea surface temperatures over the last winter, October to May season, the blue bars show standardized sea surface temperatures in this Western V region, shown with those boxes. And you can see there's a big trend, right? There's a lot of climate change component to this Western V region, but it also tends to jump up when we have a La Nina event, which is associated with cool waters here in the Eastern Pacific. And so, you know, what we saw last winter was cool La Nina sea surface temperatures associated with really warm Western V sea surface temperatures. And such conditions tend to be associated with droughts in Eastern Africa and Western North America. So we can use sea surface temperature models, or climate models, to ask the question whether we're likely to see similar conditions in October, May of 21-22, and the answer is resounding yes. The current generation of climate models can really predict these kinds of sea surface temperatures really well, and they anticipate cool La Nina-like conditions in the Eastern Pacific, accompanied by very warm Western V sea surface temperatures. And this was, again, a lot like last year. We can go to the historical record and identify similar seasons, and then we can go into the historical archive and just look at composites of those. So during these analog years, during October to May, measures of drought, like the Palmer Drought Severity Index, indicated a pretty strong tilt towards drier conditions over the southern United States, a typical kind of La Nina response, and also warmer than normal conditions over a lot of the country. And we can even push this forward a little bit into June, August, in which suggests that we could see yet again dry conditions next summer, and quite warm air temperature conditions. So now if we move to a shorter time period scale, we can look at weather forecasts. And here I'm just showing downscaled weather forecasts from our group here in Santa Barbara, anticipating the really heavy precipitation that fell in July this year over Michigan, Illinois, Indiana, Ohio, Missouri, Kansas, Texas, with damage to homes, businesses, vehicles, with about a $1.3 billion impact. And so we have increasing capacity to predict and monitor these kinds of hazards. So now we're going to move even further down in terms of spatial scale and look at lagged relationships between rainfall and air temperatures. So here it's just a simple kind of proof of concept, but I'm showing the correlation between July rainfall and changes in August vegetation. And so you can see there's, in much of the United States, there's a pretty strong relationship between the observed rainfall in July and the vegetation in the next month, due to the sort of low frequency response of vegetation to precipitation. This is a foundation for prediction. It's a little more spatially sporadic, but we can also do the same kind of things with air temperatures. And then another really strong source of predictive skill is just the persistence of vegetation from one month to the next, shown by these high correlations between conditions in vegetation in July and conditions in vegetation in August. And so just as a proof of concept, I've shown here how we can stack observations of rainfall and observations of air temperatures in July and observations of vegetation in July to make a combined forecast for the that has really quite useful levels of skill. And if we just drill down into a couple of regions of interest, for the Sandhills region in Nebraska, or the Four Corners region, we could see that these forecasts are, really having a lot of predictive capacity. And, I haven't talked about it here, but you can kind of imagine adding on top of this, both weather forecasts and climate forecasts, and kind of pushing that envelope. So to conclude, we can, look in the NOAA $1 billion disaster database and see how, the combination of, increasing the extreme climate and, increased economic activity, more people living along the coasts, is leading to, big increases in $1 billion disasters, which are, really costly. And if we look at just the US drought and fire costs between 2016 and 2020, impacts associated with those, according to NOAA, were $90 billion. And so, we're really, being hit hard by droughts and drought-related hazards like fires. But the exciting thing to me is we also have a great capability to build integrated drought early warning systems that can stack satellite and climate information to help us manage increasing risks. We have incredible satellite data, we have great weather observations, we have increasingly skillful weather forecasts, and we can see the impact of climate change on extreme sea surface temperatures and use that to produce at least sometimes skillful climate forecasts as well. And so, I'm very concerned about climate change and its impacts in the world, but I'm also very excited about working with partners to build improved early warning systems. So thanks for giving me this opportunity to share my thoughts, and I hope you have a great day. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. It has been a privilege to chair this session. We have heard an amazing series of presentations that have highlighted the link between extreme events, natural disasters, and the impacts they produce. The speakers have also presented strategies to manage these events and reduce the impacts. The societal interactions are complex, and there is much work to be done as we look to the future. These speakers illustrate that although we have challenges to face in the future, that we also have hope as we look to our future. I want to thank each panelist for their contributions to the session and to the overall conference.